The great chamber of the Galactic Council was built to make every creature inside it feel small. The ceiling was so high that the top of it disappeared into soft blue light. The walls curved around in a full circle, and the seats rose up in tiers, one above the other, like a mountain made of polished stone. Representatives from more than 60 species sat in those seats. Some had 4 arms. Some had no arms at all. Some glowed softly in the dark. Some were so large that their chairs had been specially made just for them. At the very center of the chamber, at the lowest point of the circle, stood the human podium. It was a plain thing. No decoration. No special light. Just a flat surface with a small screen and a microphone. Standing behind it was Ambassador Delia Marsh, a woman of 52 years with short gray hair and the kind of face that had seen too many long meetings and not enough sleep. She wore a dark blue coat. She stood straight. She did not look nervous, though she had every reason to be. She had just finished speaking. Her words were still sitting in the air of the chamber, waiting to be dealt with. She had told the council that the human detachment, under the command of Princess Kaelara Voss, would move to respond to the Vethari Dominion's advance into the Kaldori Reach. She had said it clearly. She had said it with a calm voice. And now she stood and waited for the response. It did not take long. The Vethari delegate rose from his seat. His name was Executor Hav, and he was everything the Vethari were known for: tall, broad through the chest, with 4 upper limbs and scales the color of deep water. He was cultured. He was intelligent. He had been doing this kind of politics for longer than most humans had been alive. And right now, he was laughing. It was not a quiet laugh. It was not a polite, diplomatic sort of sound that a person makes when something is only a little bit funny. It was a full laugh, open and easy, the kind that said he did not think he needed to hide how he felt. The sound of it carried across the whole chamber. And then, one by one, other delegates began to laugh as well. The Sethri, long-necked and silver, made a sound like bells being dropped on stone. The Mound Collective, a group of 6 small creatures who always voted together, clicked and shook. Even a few of the neutral races, the ones who usually kept their expressions blank, let small smiles touch their faces. The whole thing was being broadcast. Every major news network in the galaxy was carrying the council session live. In homes and offices and ships across dozens of star systems, people were watching Ambassador Marsh stand very still at the human podium while the chamber laughed around her. She did not move. She did not look down. She watched Executor Hav laugh until he was done, and then she watched the rest of them, and she kept her face exactly the same the whole time. When it was quiet again, Hav spoke. He said that the Vethari Dominion thanked the human representative for her announcement. He said that the human detachment's offer was noted and appreciated for its spirit. He said, with a small smile still on his face, that he looked forward to seeing what humanity could accomplish with such a fine and dedicated force. He sat down. The smile stayed. Delia Marsh gathered her papers. She said, very quietly, that the human position was on record. And she walked away from the podium. Far away, on the other side of the galaxy, a military transport ship was moving through the dark between stars. It was not a beautiful ship. It was old and a little scratched, and it smelled like metal and recycled air and too many people living in a small space. Inside its cargo hold, which had been turned into a kind of meeting room with folding chairs and a single overhead light, about 40 soldiers were sitting together. Most of them were human. A few were not. They had all just watched the council broadcast on a small screen set up on a crate. The sound had been slightly bad. The picture had been a little small. But they had all seen Executor Hav laugh, and they had all heard the chamber join in, and they had all watched Ambassador Marsh walk away from the podium in silence. Nobody in the hold said anything for a while. Captain Dale Ruiz sat in a chair near the back. He was a compact man, not very tall, with a tan face and dark eyes and the kind of hands that looked like they had done a lot of work. He had a stylus tucked in the corner of his mouth, which he chewed on the way old men chew on toothpicks. He was looking at the small screen even though it had already gone back to a news anchor talking about something else. Then he reached over and turned the screen off. "Good," he said. Just that one word. Quiet. Easy. Like he meant it. A few of the soldiers looked at him. One of them, a young man named Corporal Pete Yamamoto, tilted his head. "Good," he said. "They just laughed at us on live broadcast, Captain." Ruiz pulled the stylus out of his mouth and looked at it. "Yeah," he said. "Good." He did not explain further. Some of the soldiers who had been with him a long time nodded slowly. The newer ones just looked at each other. At the front of the hold, standing near the door with her arms crossed and her silver eyes fixed on a point somewhere on the floor, was Kaelara Voss. She had heard the laugh too. She had stood there and listened to the whole thing without changing her expression. She was 29 years old. Her father had been a human diplomat from a border world called Port Arden. Her mother had been a Veilthi queen, which meant that Kaelara had grown up between two worlds and had never completely belonged to either one. She had her mother's height and the faint silver-blue markings that moved along her neck and arms when her blood pressure changed. She had her father's jaw and his way of going very still when she was thinking hard. Right now she was thinking very hard. Lieutenant Nora Callahan came and stood beside her. Nora was younger, 27, with red hair cut short and a quick mind that never seemed to fully rest. She was the unit's intelligence officer, which meant she spent most of her time reading things and thinking about what they meant. She had been doing a lot of both in the last few days. "They have 40,000 soldiers on the ground in the Reach," Nora said quietly. 22 ships in orbit. "We have 3,200 people and 14 transports." "I know," Kaelara said. "I ran the numbers," Nora said. "Standard math says we lose. But I built a different kind of math." She held up a tablet. "It's based on something else. Something they don't know about us." Kaelara took the tablet. She read it. She read it again. The silver markings on her neck shifted slightly. Then she handed it back and said, "We start here." Nora nodded. She went to find Ruiz. Kaelara stayed by the door a moment longer. The ship was moving through the dark. The stars outside the small porthole did not move, because stars are very far away and ships, even fast ones, look still against them. But they were moving. They were getting closer. The Kaldori Reach was a region of space that most of the galaxy did not think about very much. It had no great resources that anyone wanted badly enough to fight over. It had no strategic position that changed the shape of wars. It had a few small civilizations, the Kaldori being the largest, and they were peaceful people who grew food and made things with their 6 hands and did not bother anyone. They had no army. They had no fleet. They had never needed one because nobody had ever thought them worth the trouble of attacking. Until now. The Vethery Dominion had moved into the Reach because the Vethery Dominion moved wherever it wanted, and the galaxy had learned over many centuries that it was easier to let them move than to argue. The Kaldori could not argue. They did not have the tools for it. So they had sent a message to the Galactic Council. And the Council had done what councils do, which is talk about it for a long time and then not send anyone, because sending someone meant making an enemy of the Vethery, and no one wanted that. Except, it turned out, one small force with 14 old ships and 3,200 soldiers and a princess who had read Nora Callahan's math and said, "We start here." The transport ship kept moving through the dark. The soldiers in the hold began checking their gear, quietly, the way soldiers do when they are getting close to something and they need to keep their hands busy. Ruiz chewed on his stylus and thought about chess. Nora went over her numbers again. Pete Yamamoto sharpened a blade he would probably never use and hummed something under his breath. And in the great council chamber, the laughter faded, and the session moved on to other business, and the cameras turned away from the human podium. Nobody was watching the 14 small ships anymore. That was exactly how Kaelara wanted it. Kaldori 4 was a quiet world. Its sky was the color of pale green tea in the morning, and its forests were thick with trees so tall they blocked the sun in long, dark columns. The air smelled like wet soil and something sweet that nobody had ever given a name to. Birds with 6 wings moved between the branches. The Kaldori themselves moved slowly through the wide, open settlements they had built over generations, gentle people, 6-limbed, with wide soft eyes and voices that stayed low even when they were upset. That quiet had been broken 10 days ago when the Vethery ships arrived. Now the Vethery were everywhere. Their soldiers stood at the edges of the settlements with weapons on their backs. Their communications towers had gone up in the main squares. Their supply ships came down in the fields and left deep marks in the soft earth. The Kaldori did not fight back. They did not know how. They stayed inside where they could and watched through windows and waited, the way people wait when they do not know what else to do. None of them saw the 40 humans come down through the clouds before sunrise. Pete Yamamoto had led drops before, but not many like this one. They came in with no engine burn, just gravity and stealth suits and precise timing, bleeding off speed slowly enough that the heat signature was almost nothing. The clouds were thick, which helped. The Vethari sensors on the ground were good, but they were looking for ships, not for 40 bodies falling in a controlled spread through cold air. They landed in the forest 3 kilometers east of the main Vethari forward base. Not all at once. One by one, spread across a wide area, quiet as leaves. Yamamoto hit the ground, rolled, killed his suit's small light, and stayed still for 30 seconds listening to the forest around him. Then he clicked twice on the radio, and the team came together in the dark. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Nobody needed to. They had gone over the plan many times on the transport ship, and everyone knew what to do. The first thing they did was not attack anything. They spent the next 6 hours moving through the forest looking for Kaldori. Not the ones in the settlements, those were watched too closely, but the ones who lived in the smaller houses at the edges, the farmers and the tree workers who came out before the sun was fully up to check on things. Yamamoto found the first one, a Kaldori man who was crouched near a stream looking at his irrigation lines with a worried expression. He startled when Yamamoto appeared from the trees. He made a sound like a soft bell being struck. Yamamoto held up his hands and spoke in the few words of Kaldori he had spent the last 2 weeks learning. The translator in his earpiece handled the rest. He said, "We are not Vethari. We are here to help. We need to know the forest." The Kaldori man looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at the other humans coming quietly out of the trees. Then he said something that translated as, "You are very small for an army." Yamamoto smiled and said, "Yes." The Kaldori man thought about this. Then he nodded and said, "Come with me." By the time the sun was fully up, Yamamoto's team had a network of Kaldori contacts and a detailed picture of the forest that no map could have given them. They knew where the ground was soft and slow to cross. They knew which trees had root systems that came up near the surface and tripped things that moved fast. They knew 3 dry creek beds that became invisible corridors when you walked them right. They knew where the Vethari did not go because the ground there was too uneven for their equipment. They set up relay points in the high canopy. Hidden, small, powered by cells that gave off almost no heat. The relay network let them talk to each other and to Nora Callahan in orbit without using any frequency the Vethari would be scanning for. While this was happening in the forest, Dale Ruiz was in the agricultural plains to the south with a second team of 60 soldiers. He was not there to fight anyone. He was there to work. The Vethari supply depot sat in the middle of a flat area about 2 kilometers across. It was well defended, ringed with sensor posts and guarded by patrols that rotated every 4 hours with military discipline. Ruiz looked at it for a while through a long lens from a low hill covered in tall grass. Then he stopped looking at the depot and started looking at everything around it. 3 roads led to the depot. One from the north, one from the east, one from the west. All 3 had bridges, 2 over streams, one over a dry channel that flooded in heavy rain. The roads were how the fuel came in. The fuel was how the Vethari kept their equipment running. Ruiz did not attack the depot. His team moved at night and hit the bridges. They worked quickly and quietly, using charges that made very little sound and left debris that looked like structural failure rather than sabotage. By the time the sun came up on the second day, all 3 roads were cut. The Vethari depot, with all its fuel and supplies, was now sitting in the middle of a flat area that nothing could easily reach. Then Ruiz's team found the fuel transfer junction half a kilometer from the depot's east wall. It was where the energy cells were loaded onto small vehicles for distribution. They used a chemical compound, one of Nora's ideas, that soaked into the transfer mechanism and made every energy cell it touched go inert within 12 hours. It did not harm living things. It did not make fire. It did not even smell like anything. It just made the cells stop working. The Vethari did not notice for a full day. Up in orbit, on the smallest of the 14 human transports, Nora Callahan was sitting at a communications console surrounded by 3 screens, an empty cup of coffee, and a lot of notes written on actual paper because she thought better with paper. She had tapped into the Vethari internal communication channels 3 days before insertion. Not to steal orders, the encryption on those was serious and would have taken too long. She was listening to the tone of things. The small communications. The ones officers sent to each other at odd hours. The ones that told you how people were actually feeling versus how they were officially reporting. What she heard was interesting. The Vethari officers on the ground were confident. They were talking the way soldiers talk when they think a job is finished and all that is left is administration. They were talking about rotation schedules and supply timelines and when their tours would end. They were not talking like men who thought there was anything to worry about. She began to fix that. The personal command channels that Vethari officers used for quick, private communication were slightly less encrypted than the main system. Not because the Vethari were careless, but because private channels had never needed heavy encryption before. Nobody had ever been inside their communications architecture at this level. Nora started sending sounds. Not messages. Not words. Just sounds, transmitted in short bursts at irregular intervals into the personal channels, during the dark hours of the night cycle when the planet's hemisphere the forward base was on went cold and black. The sound was human breathing. Slow. Even. The kind of breathing that meant someone was close, in the dark, very still, and watching. She sent it to 7 officers the first night. Then 12 the second. Then 20. Back in the council chamber on Nexus Station, Ambassador Marsh had been called back to the floor. The Vethari delegate Executor Hov stood and gave an update on the Kaldori Reach situation. He showed the council footage of the Vethari fleet in orbit, neat and powerful and enormous. He showed footage of Vethari soldiers controlling the main settlements, calm and organized. He said that the situation was stable. He said the Kaldori people were being treated with respect under Dominion guidelines. He said that no sign of the human force had been detected in the system. He said this last part with a small smile. Marsh listened to all of it. She stood at the podium when it was her turn. She reached into her coat and put a small data chip on the flat surface in front of her. She said, 3 days. Then she stepped back from the podium. The council murmured. A few delegates leaned together and spoke quietly. 3 days before what? 3 days until the human force arrived. 3 days until they gave up. 3 days until something else. Marsh did not explain. She collected the data chip and walked out. In the forest of Kaldori 4, Yamamoto was lying on his stomach in the dark canopy, 6 meters above the forest floor, watching through a small scope as a Vethari patrol of 20 soldiers moved along a path below him. They were moving in good order, weapons ready, scanning left and right. They were looking for something. They had been looking for something since the first relay station had disappeared and they had found nothing but a set of boot prints in the mud that stopped at the edge of a stream and did not come out the other side. He watched them move through. He counted them. He waited until the last one was out of sight. Then he clicked twice on the radio. Below him, on both sides of the path the patrol had just walked, 12 humans who had been lying still in the undergrowth for 3 hours stood up slowly and moved in the opposite direction without making a sound. On the ground at the Vethari forward base, a duty officer named Velran filed a report. 1 patrol returned from sweep of Sector 7. No contact. No sign of hostiles. He sent it upward and went back to his console. He did not know that the patrol he had just filed a report about had walked through a forest that was, at that exact moment, full of humans. The voice of reckoning was 8 kilometers long. That is the length of about 80 city blocks, laid end to end, and then given engines and weapons and filled with the most powerful soldiers in the galaxy. When it dropped out of faster-than-light travel into the Kaldori system, the light it displaced in the local space bent for a moment before the ship's systems corrected. The 6 heavy cruisers that came in with it fanned out in a standard escort formation, each one a serious fighting vessel in its own right. Together they were not a fleet. They were a statement. Grand Executor Var then stood on the bridge of the Voice of Reckoning and looked at the planet below through a wide viewport. It was a green and quiet-looking world. He had seen hundreds of quiet worlds. They had all become orderly in the end. He did not think this one would be any different. But he had come himself, rather than sending more soldiers, because something about the reports from the ground was bothering him in a way he could not quite name. He had the reports read to him again as he stood there. 340 Vethari soldiers lost in 12 days. No bodies recovered. No equipment found. No communication intercepts. No attack signatures that matched any known weapon system. 3 patrol groups that had gone into the forest and not come back. 2 supply convoys that had simply stopped, their vehicles found empty and inert, the drivers gone. The northern hub reduced to a crater of still warm debris. And then the fuel transfer junction, which had taken the engineers half a day to figure out, because the cells all looked fine until you tried to use them and found they had all gone dead. The Vethari do not lose soldiers this way. They do not lose any soldiers this way. They take casualties in pitched battles, in great engagements between fleets, in the hard-fought siege of a well-defended fortification. They do not lose people to a forest. Var then called his intelligence staff together. He wanted everything they had on human warfare. Not the summary. Everything. His analysts worked through the night cycle and brought their findings to him the next morning. Most of it was what he expected. The humans had a short military history by galactic standards, but a dense one. They had fought many wars on their own world before they understood what space was. They had developed a wide range of tactics. They were adaptable. They were stubborn. They were known to continue fighting even when the logical course of action was surrender. Then one of his analysts, a young Vethari named Sirvan who had studied non-Dominion species at the Academy, flagged something that had been sitting in the academic database for years. It was not a military report. It was a biology paper, written by a human researcher, about how humans hunted on their home world before they had advanced tools. Var then read it slowly. On the human home world, long before cities or ships or weapons, humans hunted by following their prey on foot. They did not run faster than the animals they chased. They ran longer. The animals would sprint away, putting distance between themselves and the hunters. The humans would slow to a walk, find the trail, and follow. The animals would rest. The humans would keep moving. The animals would run again. The humans would find the trail again. This would go on for hours. Sometimes for an entire day. The animal, which was usually faster and stronger than the human in a direct fight, would eventually be unable to run anymore. Its muscles would shut down from the effort of repeated sprinting. The humans would walk up to it calmly and finish what they had started. The paper noted that humans were one of the best long-distance runners in the animal kingdom of their world. They sweated to cool themselves, which very few animals could do efficiently. They did not overheat. They could recalculate a route in real time if the trail changed. They could keep going for hours past the point where most other creatures stopped. Sirvan had written one line of his own at the bottom of the report: the humans on Caldori 4 have now been running continuous operations for 12 days. Our soldiers have been on high alert for the same period. The comparison is relevant. Var then set the report down on his desk and looked at it for a while. His tactical officer had data on the physiological state of the Vethari ground forces. He had been putting off reading it. Now he read it. The numbers were not good. Vethari soldiers ran on something like adrenaline, a cortisol analog their bodies produced in response to threat. It made them fast and strong and sharp. But it burned through their system. For short, intense engagements, they were extraordinary. For 12 continuous days of high alert in a forest where something could come from any direction at any moment, against an enemy that had not given them a single clear target to focus on, they were beginning to break down. Sleep disruption. Reaction errors. One patrol had fired on a tree because someone thought they heard movement. 3 soldiers had been treated for stress responses that had no physical cause. The humans, by every indicator available, had not slowed down. Var then spent a long time in his private office that evening. He was not a man who doubted himself often or easily. He had built his career on the certainty that the galaxy operated according to clear rules of power, and that if you had more power than the thing you were fighting, you would win. He had more power than Kale Eravos. He had enormously more power. And yet the shape of things on the ground was not the shape it should have been. He decided to send a message. To let the human commander know that the executor himself had arrived, and that the situation would now resolve itself in the proper direction. He composed the message with care. He never sent it. Because before he did, he received one. It came directly to his personal channel, which very few people had the address for. It was short. It said, "Do you want to know what comes next, or would you rather find out?" It was signed by Kaelara Voss. Var then read it twice. He put his hands flat on the desk. He thought about the biology paper. He thought about the 340 soldiers and the empty forest and the fuel cells that all went dead at the same time. He thought about Executor Hav laughing in the council chamber 14 days ago. He did not respond. On the command ship, Kaelara sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. The message had been sent. She had not expected a response. She had sent it for a different reason. Dale Ruiz was sitting across from her with his chessboard. He had been working on the same position for 4 days, which was unusually long even for him. He looked up. "He's not going to answer," he said. "No," she agreed. "So he's going to try to find out instead." "Yes." Ruiz moved a piece on the board. "Good," he said. Down in Nora Callahan's section of the ship, the lights were still on at what passed for 2 in the morning. Nora was not sleeping. She had not been sleeping much for days, which she knew was unsustainable, but the intelligence picture was almost complete and she could not stop now. She had the positions of every Vethari unit on the planet mapped to within 100 meters. She had their patrol timings. She had their communication windows. She had the specific 3-hour gap each night when the orbital sensor array rotated away from the southern continent, leaving a blind spot over exactly the area she needed. She also had something that was harder to put in a report, a feeling for how the Vethari officers thought. Not what they would do, that was tactics. How they thought. The assumptions they made without knowing they were making them. The way they organized information. The thing they were not watching because they were too certain it was not a threat. She had built a plan around that last part. She went to find Kaelara and Ruiz and spread it out on the table between them. It was not a conventional plan. There were no battle lines, no assault coordinates, no moment of decisive engagement. It was more like a series of doors being closed, one after another, in a specific order, until the only thing left open was the one you wanted. Ruiz read it and was quiet for a while. Then he said, "This works if they do what I think they'll do." "They will," Nora said. "They've never had a reason not to." "They'll send everything into the south," he said. "Yes. Because that's where we've been. Because that's where they think we are. And because when a Vethari commander decides to end something, he does it with everything he has. It's the only way they know." Kaelara was looking at the plan. The silver markings on her arms were moving slowly, the way they did when she was working through something difficult. Then they settled. "Start moving the north team tonight," she said. On the planet below, Var then had made his decision. He gathered his senior officers and told them, "Tomorrow, 30,000 soldiers sweep the southern continent. Full sensor coverage. Aerial units. Every corridor closed. They find the humans, and they finish this." The officers confirmed the order and went to carry it out. Var then went back to the viewport and looked at the green world below. He was not a man who made mistakes often. But somewhere in the back of his mind, quiet as a whisper, was the memory of a biology paper about creatures that followed you until you fell. He pushed the thought away. He had 30,000 soldiers and the largest ship in the sector. The thought came back anyway. The 30,000 soldiers moved south at first light. They moved in good order, in long lines that spread across the full width of the southern continent, closing every gap between them. Aerial units flew overhead in a grid pattern, scanning with sensors that could detect a heat signature the size of a human hand from 500 meters up. Communication relays bounced signals between units every 30 seconds so nothing could go dark without the whole chain knowing immediately. Var then had designed this sweep personally. It was thorough. It was correct. It swept through a completely empty forest. The humans were not there. They had not been there for 18 hours. Every relay point in the canopy had been taken down. Every piece of equipment had been packed. Every footprint in the soft earth had been carefully obscured. The Kaldori contacts who had helped them were back in their homes, sitting quietly with their 6 hands folded, looking as innocent as they always looked, because Caldori were very good at looking like they were doing nothing. The 30,000 soldiers walked through the trees and found birds and soft ground and nothing else. 3 hours into the sweep, the communications officer on the lead unit tried to send a routine update to the Northern Command Relay. Nothing came back. He tried again. Still nothing. He tried a secondary channel. That was gone too. He began trying every frequency he had access to, one after another, and found the same silence on all of them. The communications across the entire southern continent had gone dark, all at once, with no warning and no explanation. At that same moment, Dale Ruiz was standing on a low ridge north of the Vethry supply hub, watching through a scope as his artillery team settled into position. They had moved north through 2 nights, using a series of dried creek beds that the Caldori farmer had shown Yamamoto in the first days, moving in small groups, never together, never loud. They had arrived at their positions before the Vethry sweep had even begun. Ruiz looked at his watch, a simple one, with hands, because he had learned long ago that simple things were reliable and complicated things broke at the wrong moment. He looked at the hub in the scope. Then he looked at his watch again. He said, "Now." Every artillery platform fired in a coordinated sequence, not all at once, but in a timed rotation that walked the strike across the hub in overlapping waves. The hub held munitions and fuel and the main power source for the Vethry orbital sensor array. The first strike hit the power source. The array in orbit lost its feed and began running on backup, which gave it partial coverage and a blind spot over exactly the northern quarter of the continent. The second wave hit the fuel storage. The third hit the munitions depot. The hub burned with a light that could be seen from the upper atmosphere and would not stop burning for 6 hours. Ruiz watched it for a moment. Then he said, "Pack up, move south," and turned away. While the hub was burning and the sweep force was walking through an empty forest with no communications, Pete Yamamoto was in the agricultural plains south of the main Vethry settlement occupation zone. He had been there for 2 days. His team of 80 soldiers had moved into the area hidden among groups of Caldori farming vehicles, big slow machines that moved across the flat land cutting and sorting crops, operated by Caldori workers who asked no questions and drove the same routes they always drove. Yamamoto's people sat in the back of the vehicles and ate protein bars and slept in shifts and waited. They were not there to fight the occupation soldiers. The main settlements on Caldori 4 had containment barriers, long fence lines powered by energy cells, with gates that required Vethry authorization codes to open. The barriers were not walls. They were just powered lines that the Caldori could not cross without being stopped. Inside them, 2 million Caldori were living reduced lives, moving only where they were told to move, working only what the Vethry allowed them to work, eating less than they should because the Vethry had redirected the food distribution to their own supply chain. Yamamoto's team reached the perimeter of the barriers before the sun came up on the 3rd day. They split into groups of 4, each group assigned to a specific section of the power line. They had cutters that worked on the cell feeds, not destroying them, just disconnecting them from the line for long enough to drop the barrier in that section. Each group had 30 seconds to do their job and then get clear. Yamamoto counted down on the radio. At 0, 80 soldiers moved at once. All along the barrier lines surrounding the 3 largest settlements on Caldori 4, the powered fences went down simultaneously. For a moment nothing happened. Then a Caldori child near one of the gap points stepped forward and put a foot outside the line. Nothing happened. She looked back at her mother. Her mother looked at the gap. Then the mother walked through it, and other Caldori began to follow, and within 10 minutes the settlements were pouring out of themselves in every direction. 2 million Caldori, moving outward through every gap, spreading across the open land they had not been able to reach for weeks. The Vethry occupation soldiers, who had been managing a population control operation, not fighting a battle, found themselves suddenly surrounded by an enormous, quiet, unstoppable flood of people who simply walked past them and kept going. There was nothing to shoot. There was nothing to stop. There was just a world of people going back to their homes and their fields and their trees, and the Vethry standing in the middle of it with their weapons in their hands and nothing useful to do with them. In orbit, Nora Callahan was watching the Vethry fleet through her sensor feeds and making notes. The 6 cruisers had been holding a standard protective formation around the Voice of Reckoning for days. Good formation. Solid. The kind of formation that was designed for exactly one kind of engagement, another fleet coming straight at them. The 14 human transports did not come straight at them. AllHFY had given Nora the fleet 3 days ago. The transports had been reconfigured as much as you could reconfigure a light transport, which was not much, but enough for what Nora needed. They had extra sensor packages on 2 of them. They had modified engine output sequences on 4 others. The rest were there to move, quickly and unpredictably, in patterns that Nora had developed from a study of something called convoy disruption tactics, used on Earth in a water-ocean war more than 4 centuries ago. The transports did not attack the dreadnought. They went after the cruisers, one at a time, in a rotating pattern that never let any single cruiser hold its position. One transport would make an aggressive approach on a cruiser's weak side. The cruiser would have to move to present its defensive face. While it moved, a second transport would approach a different cruiser from a different angle. The cruiser protecting the dreadnought's stern would shift to cover. A third transport would appear near the first cruiser's old position. And so it went, endlessly rotating, no 2 approaches from the same direction, no 2 intervals the same length. The cruisers could not hold formation and respond to the threats simultaneously. After 4 hours, 3 of them had been caught out of position and struck with focused fire from 2 transports at once, enough to damage their drives and take them out of the engagement. The other 3 were spread so far from the dreadnought trying to respond to threats that the voice of reckoning was sitting alone in its section of space. On the bridge, Varthen's tactical officer said very quietly, "Grand Executor. The formation is broken." Varthen did not move for a moment. He looked at the tactical display. He could see the hub burning on the planet below. He had received the report from the southern sweep, the forest was empty. He had received the report from the settlement zone, the barriers were down, the population dispersed. He could see his 3 disabled cruisers and his 3 repositioned cruisers and the open space around his own ship. His political advisor spoke next. She told him that the Galactic Council was watching a live broadcast. The broadcast was showing Caldori citizens walking freely through their settlements while Vethari soldiers stood in the streets with weapons and nothing to do with them. The council members were not laughing. Varthen's communications officer told him there was a channel request waiting. From AllHFY. He stood very still for a long moment. Then he said, "Put her through." The communication channel was video only. No physical meeting. No ceremony. Varthen sat in his command chair on the bridge of the voice of reckoning. He had sent his officers to other parts of the bridge so the conversation would be private, though he knew that was probably a gesture more than a reality. AllHFY was at a plain metal table on her ship. There was a cup of something on the table beside her. The cup looked like it had gone cold a while ago. She was not in uniform. She was wearing what looked like a heavy work shirt, and her silver eyes were calm in a way that Varthen found harder to read than anger would have been. He asked her what she wanted. She told him. Vethari withdrawal from the Caldori Reach. Complete. Every soldier, every ship, every communications tower and supply structure. Full restoration of Caldori authority over their settlements, their land, their food, and their own decisions. A formal statement filed with the Galactic Council acknowledging that the Caldori Reach now fell under the protective standing of the human detachment. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said that she was a small force asking very large things. She picked up the cold cup and held it in both hands without drinking from it. She said, "You have been in this fight for 15 days. It feels like 15 months. I know, because I have been fighting it from the other side and that is how it feels to me too. Imagine 15 more. Imagine 15 after that." Varthen was quiet. She said, "Your soldiers on the ground are at their limit. Not because they are weak. Because what we did to them was designed specifically for how they are built. I knew the shape of this fight before it started. I knew how long you could sustain it and I knew how long we could. Those numbers are not close." He said, "You planned this from the start." She set the cup down. She said, "We planned the first 3 days. Everything after that, your soldiers taught us. Every sweep that came up empty told us where you expected us to be. Every patrol timing told us when to move. Every communication gap told us where to hit. We learned from you the whole time." There was a long silence. Varthen looked at the tactical display to his left, then back at the screen. He looked at the planet below, a small world, not especially valuable, not especially powerful. He thought about what another month would cost him. He thought about what 3 months would cost him. He thought about the biology paper about creatures that followed and followed until the thing they were chasing simply had nothing left. He ended the channel without saying anything further. 37 minutes later, the voice of reckoning began its withdrawal vector. The 3 functional cruisers fell in around it. The 3 damaged ones were brought in on tow lines. The troop transports on the surface began their liftoff sequence, one by one, in an orderly column that rose from the surface of Caldori 4 and climbed toward orbit and then toward the waiting fleet. They did not hurry. Varthan's forces did not hurry. But they went. The news reached the Galactic Council chamber before the last Vethari ship had cleared the system. The session was already in progress, some other business, something about trade routes, and it stopped when the notification came in. Every delegate received it on their personal screen at the same moment. The Vethari Dominion's Third Fleet was filing a formal withdrawal from the Caldori Reach. Terms on record. Acknowledged by both parties. Ambassador Delia Marsh was not in the chamber when the notification arrived. She was in a small office down the corridor, eating a sandwich and reading through paperwork. Her assistant came in and told her. She looked at him for a moment. Then she put down the sandwich, stood up, straightened her coat, and walked to the chamber. She stood at the human podium. The chamber was very quiet. 14 days ago it had been full of laughter. Now it was so quiet that Marsh could hear the ventilation system running in the walls. She looked around at the delegates, the Sethri, the Mound Collective, Executor Hav in his seat with an expression that was difficult to describe because it had never been on his face before. She looked at all of them. Then she read the terms of the withdrawal into the official record. Slowly. Clearly. Every word. When she was finished she looked at the chamber once more and sat down. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. On Caldori 4, Ruiz and Yamamoto walked through one of the main settlements with a small escort. The Vethari were gone. The barriers were down. The streets felt different, wider somehow, even though they were the same streets, because people were moving through them freely, going where they wanted to go, stopping to talk to each other, looking up at the sky with the particular expression of people who have been kept inside for too long and are not yet sure the open air is fully real. Children were everywhere. Children always came out first. A Caldori elder approached Ruiz near the center of the settlement. She was small, half his height, with soft gold markings on her upper limbs and wide eyes that had seen a long life. She said something in Caldori. The translator in Ruiz's earpiece took a moment. Then it said, "We thought no one was coming." Ruiz stood with that for a second. He was a man who did not make speeches and did not say things he did not mean. He thought about what was true and what was the right amount of it to say. He said, "We are always late. But we always come." The elder looked at him. She reached out with one of her upper limbs and touched his arm briefly, very gently. Then she turned and walked back toward the people gathering in the square behind her. Yamamoto, standing a few steps behind Ruiz, said nothing. He watched the elder go. After a moment he looked at the sky. It was the color of pale green tea. Nora Callahan filed her after-action report with the Galactic Coalition Military Archives 11 days after the withdrawal. It was 412 pages long. The summary at the front was 3 sentences. She had rewritten those 3 sentences 17 times. The final version said, "The human force was not victorious through superior size or firepower. It was victorious because it was composed of humans, who have been hunting, enduring, and adapting for 200,000 years, and who do not stop. Every military force in the galaxy should sit with that." The report was classified within 6 hours. 17 copies had been distributed before the classification went through. Within a month, fragments of it were being discussed in academic institutions on 6 worlds. Within 3 months, a full copy was circulating quietly in the military planning sections of 4 separate governments. 1 week after the withdrawal, Varthan sent Kaelera a private message. It was short. He asked what species her father was. She wrote back, "Human." 3 days passed. Then he sent one more line. It said, "I begin to understand why your mother chose him." Kaelera showed it to Ruiz. He read it. Handed the screen back. picked up the chessboard he had been staring at for a week. "Huh," he said. "That might be the nicest thing HFY has ever said about us." "I think it might be," she said. In the months that followed, the Galactic Council quietly expanded the human detachment's operating mandate to cover 12 additional star systems. The paperwork described it as a jurisdictional clarification. No one called it what it was. The HFY delegate abstained from the vote and did not vote against it, which was itself a thing that had never happened before. 6 smaller species sent formal diplomatic inquiries to Port Arden within the same month. They asked for crew exchange programs, observer positions, and invitations to training exercises. The humans said yes to all of it. At a HFY military academy, a new course was added to the curriculum. The title translated as Study of the Human Way of War. The first term was oversubscribed in 48 hours. The story ended the way it began, with Kaelera watching something. She was sitting on the outer hull of her transport ship, magnetic boots holding her to the plating, looking out at the stars above Caldori 4 while the planet turned slowly below her. The cold cup was in her hands again. She was not thinking about the battle. She was thinking about what came next. There was always something that came next. She had come to understand that this was the most human thing about her. Ruiz came out of the hatch and sat nearby without being asked. They stayed like that for a while. "Ready to go home," he said. She looked at the stars. The planet turned. The cold cup sat in her hands. "Not yet," she said.